Did our nurse remember to pack enough Band-Aids for the big scary patrol today? Lieutenant Commander Brock Hollister's voice cut through the morning briefing like a blade designed to wound, and the laughter that followed from three of his operators told Chief Hospital Corpsman Renata Vasquez everything she needed to know about how this deployment would continue. She stood at the rear of the Tactical Operations Center, her hands folded precisely behind her back, her expression betraying nothing as the words washed over her like water against stone. The forward operating base sat perched in the Corangle Valley like a wound in the mountainside, surrounded by peaks that had swallowed empires and spit out their bones. Diesel generators hummed beneath the distant percussion of helicopter rotors, and the smell of burning waste mingled with the thin mountain air that made every breath feel insufficient. Vasquez had been stationed here for 4 months, and in that time, she had learned that Lieutenant Commander Hollister viewed her presence as a political inconvenience rather than a tactical asset. She watched him gesture at the maps spread across the planning table, his movements theatrical and precise, the kind of confidence that came from never having been proven catastrophically wrong. He was magazine cover handsome, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, his physique maintained with the dedication of someone who understood that image mattered more than substance in certain circles. The mission brief outlined a routine patrol through the valley's eastern corridor, 12 kilometers of hostile terrain that had claimed American lives before and would claim them again. Vasquez noted the route, noted the terrain features, noted the elevation changes that would affect both movement and any potential medical evacuations. Her mind worked through scenarios automatically, cataloging the supplies in her medical kit, the tourniquet staged on her vest, the surgical tools she prayed she would not need to use in the field. But beneath that clinical assessment, something else stirred, something older. Her eyes traced the ridgelines on the map, calculating fields of fire, identifying dead ground, finding the positions where she would place shooters if she wanted to destroy a patrol moving through that valley. She caught herself and looked away. Hollister assigned positions for the patrol, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who had never doubted his own judgment. Vasquez, you will remain at the rear of the formation. Stay out of the way, keep your head down, and if any of my operators stub their toes, you can kiss it better. More laughter. She noted which men joined in and which remained silent. Petty Officer Second Class Tomas Reyes did not laugh. The team's designated marksman stood apart from the others, his weathered face carrying the quiet watchfulness of someone who had learned to see what others missed. He caught Vasquez's eye across the room and gave a slight nod, so subtle that anyone not looking for it would have missed the gesture entirely. There was something in that acknowledgement, a recognition she could not quite define. Master Chief Petty Officer Darnell Okonkwo observed from the corner, his arms crossed over a chest that had absorbed 25 years of naval special warfare. His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes moved between Hollister and Vasquez with the patience of a man who had learned that truth eventually surfaces, no matter how deep it is buried. The briefing concluded. Vasquez moved to her medical station to conduct final checks on her equipment. Her hands worked with precision that spoke of thousands of repetitions, each item placed exactly where muscle memory would find it in the chaos of a firefight. Hemostatic gauze, chest seals, nasopharyngeal airways. The tools of preservation arranged with the same deliberate care that another version of herself had once applied to instruments of destruction. If you're watching this story unfold from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from today. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. Stories like this one, about courage hidden beneath contempt and strength disguised as silence, happen in communities everywhere. You might have a quiet hero in your own neighborhood, someone whose humble appearance conceals an extraordinary truth. If stories about sacrifice and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible accounts that honor the overlooked warriors among us. Now let us continue. Petty Officer Tanaka approached her station, the young medic trainee she had been assigned to mentor. He watched her hands move through the equipment check and asked why she never responded when Hollister said those things. Vasquez did not look up from her work. "Words are just words," she said. "They do not change what is true." Tanaka pressed further. He asked if it bothered her, being treated that way by someone who was supposed to lead them. Vasquez paused, her fingers resting on a package of surgical sutures. She told him that she had been underestimated before. She told him that it had never changed what she was capable of doing when the moment required it. Outside, the morning sun crested the eastern peaks and spilled golden light across the valley that would try to kill them in a few hours. Vasquez sealed her medical kit and rose to join the formation, her bearing straight, her movements economical, her face revealing nothing of what stirred beneath. But what Lieutenant Commander Hollister did not know, what none of them knew except perhaps the dead man who would whisper it with his final breath, was that within 6 hours the woman he dismissed as a Band-Aid dispenser would save every life in his team, including his own. The patrol moved out at 712 operators plus one corpsman threading through the wire and into terrain that had been killing invaders since before Alexander's armies broke themselves against these same mountains. Vasquez walked at the rear of the formation as ordered, her medical kit secure against her back, her sidearm checked and rechecked with a discipline that had become as automatic as breathing. The valley stretched before them like the throat of something hungry, its walls rising steep and scarred on either side, studded with boulders and scrub vegetation that could conceal 100 fighters. The morning air carried the bite of altitude, thin enough to make her lungs work harder, cold enough to keep her alert. She watched the ridgelines as they walked, her eyes moving in patterns she had learned long before she learned to suture wounds. Hollister's voice crackled over the radio, ordering the formation to increase pace. He wanted to clear the exposed ground before the sun climbed high enough to make them easy silhouettes against the valley floor. Vasquez agreed with the tactical assessment, even as she noted that he had not consulted his senior enlisted or his designated marksman before making the call. Reyes moved 30 meters ahead of her, his 13 Malawian Quachas rifle cradled with the easy familiarity of a man who had carried it through a dozen deployments. She watched him scan the terrain and recognized the methodology, the way his eyes quartered each sector before moving to the next, the way his body positioned itself to present the smallest possible target while maintaining freedom of movement. He was good. She had known many who were good. The wind shifted, carrying dust and the faint smell of cooked fires from a village somewhere beyond the ridgeline. Vasquez felt something tighten in her chest, a warning that lived in the animal part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments before she traded her rifle for medical supplies. The memory came unbidden, triggered by the wind and the dust and the weight of the mountains pressing down. She was 26 years old, standing in a classroom at Quantico, facing a room full of Marine Scout sniper candidates who looked at her like she had wandered into the wrong building. The instructor cadre had assigned her to teach wind reading, and the students had made their displeasure known through silence and averted eyes. Gunnery Sergeant Elijah Crawford had stood at the back of the room that day, arms folded, watching. He was the senior instructor, a legend in the community, a man who had written doctrine that was still being taught years after his retirement. When the class ended and the students filed out without a single question, Crawford had approached her. He had told her that the rifle does not care about opinions. He had told her that the bullet does not know who sent it. He had told her that she would face doubt and dismissal every day of her career, and that the only answer was to be so good that denial became impossible. Then he had walked her to the range and watched her put 10 rounds through the same hole at 800 meters. She had been the first female instructor at the Scout Sniper School. She had trained men who went on to become legends themselves, men who whispered her call sign with something approaching reverence, even as they publicly questioned whether women belonged in their community. Whisper, because the targets never heard the shot that killed them. The radio crackled again, pulling her back to the present. Hollister was asking if the nurse needed a rest break, if her little legs were getting tired. Vasquez keyed her radio and responded with a single word. Negative. She heard someone laugh over the net, the sound harsh and crackling through the encrypted channel. Reyes dropped back from his position, falling into step beside her for a few meters. He did not look at her directly, his eyes still scanning the terrain, but his voice was low and curious when he spoke. He asked where she had learned to read terrain like that. Vasquez asked what he meant. He said he'd been watching her watch the ridgelines. He said her eyes moved in patterns he recognized, patterns they taught at certain schools for certain specialties. He said he had seen that 1,000-yard stare before, in snipers who had looked through their scopes at too many things that could not be unseen. She told him she had been deployed before, that anyone who spent time in country learned to watch the high ground. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was not what he saw. He said he saw someone who was calculating range and windage without conscious thought, someone whose body remembered things her mouth would not say. He said he had learned to trust his instincts about people, and his instincts told him there was something she was not telling them. Vasquez did not respond. The patrol continued forward, winding through the valley toward the narrow passage that would funnel them into the kill zone none of them saw coming. Tanaka caught up to her, breathing harder than he should have been at this pace. He asked what Reyes had wanted, and Vasquez told him it was nothing important. She used the moment to teach him something, pointing out the signs of dehydration she could see in his movement, reminding him to drink water regularly even when he did not feel thirsty. The altitude would steal moisture from his body faster than he realized. The lesson was genuine, but it was also deflection. She did not want to think about what Reyes had seen, did not want to examine why his recognition had stirred something in her chest that felt like both fear and longing. She had buried that version of herself for good reasons. She had watched a young Marine die because she knew how to kill but not how to heal, and she had sworn that she would never again stand helpless while someone bled out in her arms. The medical training had been brutal in different ways than sniper school. Learning anatomy instead of ballistics, studying wound patterns instead of terminal performance, teaching her hands to repair what other hands had destroyed. She had graduated at the top of her class, qualified Fleet Marine Force, and requested assignment to Naval Special Warfare because she believed that the hardest cases deserved the best care. She had not expected to spend her deployment being dismissed as a Band-Aid dispenser by a man whose tactical judgment she would not trust to organize a supply run. The sun climbed higher. The valley walls pressed closer. And somewhere on the ridgeline ahead, eyes that were not friendly watched the patrol approach and waited for the perfect moment to spring the trap that would change everything. The valley narrowed as they pushed deeper into the corridor, the walls rising on either side like the closing jaws of something patient and merciless. Vasquez felt the wrongness settle into her bones with each step forward, a sensation she had learned to trust through years of operations that had taught her the difference between paranoia and instinct. This was not paranoia. This was the silence before the hammer fell. She keyed her radio and spoke carefully, keeping her voice neutral and professional. She suggested to the lieutenant commander that the terrain ahead presented significant tactical concerns, that the elevation on both flanks created overlapping fields of fire that would be difficult to counter if contact was made. Hollister's response came back clipped and dismissive. He told her to stick to bandages and let the operators worry about tactics. He told her that he had been running patrols through this valley since before she finished nursing school. He told her that if he wanted medical advice, he would ask for it, and until then she should maintain radio discipline and stay in her lane. Master Chief Okonkwo's voice came over the net a moment later, calm and measured. He suggested that perhaps they should send a team to clear the high ground before the main element proceeded through the choke point. His tone carried the diplomatic weight of a senior enlisted man trying to correct his officer without openly contradicting him. Hollister rejected the suggestion. He said they were already behind schedule, that air support had a limited window, that stopping to clear every rock and ridge would turn a 12-kilometer patrol into a 3-day operation. He ordered the formation to push through and reminded everyone that speed was security. Vasquez watched the ridgelines and said nothing more. She had learned long ago that some men could not be convinced by words, that they required the brutal education of consequences before they would consider perspectives other than their own. She prayed that today's lesson would not cost lives, even as the weight in her chest told her that prayer would not be enough. The patrol entered the narrow passage, rock walls pressing close on either side, the sky reduced to a strip of blue high above. Vasquez counted her steps, measured the distance to cover, calculated the time it would take to reach the wounded if contact was made in this confined space. The numbers were not encouraging. Reyes moved with increased alertness, his rifle coming up slightly, his pace slowing as his eyes swept the heights above. He felt it too. Vasquez could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his finger moved closer to the trigger guard. He was a predator sensing the presence of other predators, and his instincts were screaming the same warning hers had been broadcasting since they entered the valley. She saw the glint a fraction of a second before the world exploded. Sunlight reflecting off glass or metal, high on the eastern ridge, 400 meters out. Her mouth opened to shout a warning, her hand reaching for a radio, her body already beginning to move toward cover. But physics and violence move faster than human reaction, and before the first syllable left her throat, the ridge erupted in fire and thunder. The RPG struck 3 meters in front of the lead element, the explosion throwing 2 operators off their feet and filling the air with shrapnel and dust. Automatic weapons fire poured down from both ridge lines, the distinctive chatter of PCAM machine guns layering over the sharp crack of AK-47 rifles. Muzzle flashes sparkled across the heights like malevolent stars, and the canyon became a kill zone designed by someone who understood exactly how to destroy an American patrol. Vasquez dove behind a boulder as rounds snapped through the air where she had been standing. Her training took over the medical protocols she had drilled until they became reflex. She assessed her own body first, checking for wounds she might not feel through the adrenaline. Nothing. She was intact. She could function. The radio exploded with overlapping voices, men calling contacts, calling casualties, calling for support that was still 15 minutes away. She heard Hollister screaming orders that contradicted each other, his voice pitched high with the shock of a man whose carefully constructed reality had just been shattered by 7.62mm truth. She saw Reyes go down. The designated marksman had been moving toward cover when a burst caught him across the torso, the impact spinning him sideways and dropping him in the open ground between 2 boulders. His rifle clattered away from his reaching hand, and Vasquez watched his body curl around the wounds as blood began to pool beneath him. She did not think. She did not calculate odds or consider personal safety. She simply moved. The sprint across open ground took 4 seconds that stretched into eternity. Rounds cracked past her head, struck the dirt at her feet, ricocheted off rocks with angry whines. She ran in a crouch, zigzagging on instinct, her medical kit bouncing against her back as she closed the distance to the fallen marksman. She slid into position beside Reyes, her hands already pulling supplies from her kit, her eyes scanning his wounds with the desperate speed of someone who knew that seconds meant the difference between life and death. The damage was catastrophic. Multiple penetrating wounds to the chest and abdomen, arterial blood pumping with each heartbeat, the wet sucking sound of a collapsed lung beneath shattered ribs. Reyes looked up at her with eyes that were already beginning to dim, and in that moment Vasquez understood that all her training, all her skill, all the knowledge she had accumulated since trading her rifle for medical supplies would not be enough to save him. Some wounds could not be healed. Some damage could only be witnessed. She worked anyway. She packed wounds and applied pressure and spoke to him in a voice she fought to keep steady. She told him to stay with her, told him help was coming, told him all the lies that medical personnel tell dying patients, because the truth is too heavy to speak aloud. Above them, the battle raged on. Around them, his brothers fought and bled and called for the air support that would not arrive in time to matter. And beneath her hands, Tomas Reyes reached for his fallen rifle with fingers that could no longer grip, his eyes fixed on hers with a message she was not yet ready to understand. The blood would not stop. Vasquez worked with hands that had treated hundreds of wounds, packing hemostatic gauze into holes that kept weeping crimson faster than she could staunch them. Reyes had taken at least 4 rounds through his plate carrier, the impacts finding the gaps between ceramic plates with the cruel precision of ballistics meeting anatomy. His lung was collapsing, his blood pressure dropping, his body shutting down system by system as she fought to hold him together. She spoke to him constantly, her voice a lifeline she willed him to grip. She told him to focus on her eyes, to breathe when she told him to breathe, to stay with her because extraction was coming and she would not lose him in this valley. The word relies wrapped in hope, and they both knew it. Reyes tried to speak. Blood bubbled at his lips, and his voice came out as a wet whisper that she had to lean close to hear. He asked her why she was out here. He said he had watched her, that he knew she was not just a corpseman, that he had seen something in her eyes he recognized from snipers who had carried the weight too long. Vasquez told him to save his strength, to stop talking and focus on breathing. But Reyes shook his head with what little strength remained, and his hand found hers with fingers slick with his own blood. He told her he was not going to make it. He told her he had known since the rounds hit that this was the end of his story. But he needed her to hear something before he went, needed her to understand what he had seen and what it meant. She begged him to stop, to hold on, to let her work. The gauze in her hands was already saturated, and she reached for more, even as the rational part of her mind calculated blood loss and time and probability and found only zeros. Reyes turned his head toward his fallen rifle, the 13 Malawian Quachas lying just beyond his reach in the dust. The weapon that had been his constant companion through years of deployments, the tool he had used to protect his brothers and eliminate threats from distances that most people could not comprehend. His eyes moved from the rifle to Vasquez and back again. "Take it," he said. His voice was fading, the words coming slower, the pauses between them growing longer. "You know what to do." Vasquez felt something crack inside her chest. She told him she was a corpseman, that her job was to save lives, not take them, that she had put down her rifle years ago and sworn she would never pick one up again. She told him he needed to stay focused on surviving, that he could not give up, that she would not let him die in this valley. But Reyes smiled, and in that smile she saw that he had known all along. Somehow, through watching and listening and reading the signs she thought she had hidden, he had understood what she was, what she had been, what she still was beneath the medical supplies and the corpsman insignia and the years of telling herself she had changed. He whispered her call sign. Whisper. The word floated between them like a ghost from a life she had tried to bury, and she felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the man beneath her hands slipped further toward the darkness. His fingers tightened on hers one final time. He told her that his brothers were dying. He told her that the lieutenant was hit and command was falling apart. He told her that the enemy had the high ground and superior numbers, and that without a marksman to answer their fire, everyone in this valley would die. "Take the rifle," he said again. "Save them." And then Tomas Reyes, Petty Officer Second Class, United States Navy, designated marksman, father of 2 daughters who would never see him again, closed his eyes and released his final breath into the thin mountain air. Vasquez knelt frozen over his body, her hands still pressed against wounds that no longer mattered, her mind refusing to accept what her training had already confirmed. Gone. He was gone. Another name for the wall, another flag for the family, another hole in the fabric of a team that would never be whole again. The battle crashed on around her. She heard Hollister screaming into the radio, his voice ragged with pain and panic. He had been hit in the leg, femoral bleed, barely controlled by a tourniquet that someone had applied in the chaos. Without their designated marksman, the team could not effectively answer the fire pouring down from the ridgelines. They were pinned, bleeding, dying by inches while the enemy methodically worked to finish what the ambush had started. Master Chief Okonkwo had taken command, his voice cutting through the chaos with the calm authority of a man who had survived worse and refused to break. He was organizing what defense they could manage, directing fire, calling for the air support that was still 12 minutes away. 12 minutes might as well have been 12 hours. Vasquez looked at Reyes one final time. She closed his eyes with gentle fingers, whispered something that might have been a prayer or might have been a promise, and then she turned to look at the rifle lying in the dust beside him. The 13 Malawian Quachas Mod 5. Bolt action, magazine fed, chambered in 300 Win Mag. Effective range beyond 1,000 meters in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. She knew every component of that weapon, had trained hundreds of Marines to shoot its predecessors, had carried rifles like it through firefights that still visited her in dreams she could not escape. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The weight was familiar, achingly so, like greeting a lover she had abandoned years ago. The stock settled against her shoulder with the ease of muscle memory, and she felt something shift inside her as the boundary between who she had been and who she had become began to blur. Above her, muzzle flashes continued to sparkle across the ridgeline. Below her, her teammates continued to bleed, and in her hands, the instrument of her former life waited to see what she would choose. The rifle felt like coming home to a house she had burned down years ago. Vasquez pulled the weapon to her chest and rolled behind the boulder that had sheltered Reyes in his final moments. Her hands moved without conscious direction, decades of training asserting themselves through the fog of grief and adrenaline. She checked the chamber and found a round already seated. She verified the magazine and counted 9 rounds remaining. She shouldered the weapon and pressed her eye to the scope, and the world compressed itself into a circle of magnified clarity. The reticle settled on the eastern ridgeline, and she saw them. Fighters moving between positions, muzzle flashes marking their locations, the choreography of an ambush being prosecuted by men who knew their business. She counted at least 15 shooters on the eastern ridge alone, with more on the western side pouring fire into the kill zone, where her teammates crouched and bled. Her finger found the trigger guard, and she forced herself to pause. The scope's zero might have shifted during the chaos. Reyes had been meticulous about his equipment, but a fall could throw off even the most carefully calibrated optic. She needed to confirm before she trusted a shot at distance. The memory surfaced unbidden, rising from the depths where she had tried to drown it. She was 31 years old, kneeling in the dust of Ramadi, a young Marine corporal dying in her arms. His name was Hendricks, and he had taken shrapnel from an IED that had shredded his legs and opened his femoral artery. She was a sniper then, the best shooter in her platoon, but she did not know how to stop the bleeding. She did not know how to pack a wound, or apply a tourniquet, or do any of the things that might have kept his heart pumping long enough for the medevac to arrive. She had held him while he died, whispering promises she could not keep, watching the light leave his eyes while her rifle lay useless beside her. He was 19 years old. He had shown her pictures of his girlfriend back home, talked about the wedding they were planning, asked her advice about engagement rings, because she was the only woman in the unit, and he figured she might know about such things. Hendricks died because she knew how to kill, but not how to heal. She made her choice that day, kneeling in his blood, swearing that she would never again watch helplessly while someone slipped away. She would learn to save lives instead of taking them. She would trade her scope for surgical tools and her rifle for medical supplies, and she would become the person who kept Marines alive instead of the person who made enemies dead. But now Reyes was gone, and Hollister was screaming, and rounds were snapping overhead, and the men she had sworn to protect were dying because no one could answer the fire from the ridgelines. She thought of Hendricks. She thought of Reyes. She thought of Tanaka somewhere behind her, the young medic trainee who looked at her like she had all the answers, who would die in this valley if someone did not change the equation. The rifle in her hands was not a betrayal. It was a tool, just like the hemostatic gauze and the chest seals and the surgical instruments she carried in her medical kit. Tools had no morality. Only the hands that wielded them could choose between destruction and preservation. She settled her breathing. She pressed her eye to the scope. She found the RPG gunner who had killed Reyes, the man who was even now reloading his launcher to send another rocket into the American position. 412 meters. Crosswind from the east, 6 to 8 miles per hour. Elevation differential. Shooter above target by approximately 15 degrees. She calculated the adjustments automatically, her mind performing computations it had never forgotten despite years of disuse. Her finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger itself. She exhaled half a breath and held. The reticle steadied on the center of the target's chest. She squeezed. The rifle barked, the recoil pushing against her shoulder with the familiar authority of controlled violence. Through the scope, she watched the RPG gunner crumple, the round finding him exactly where she had aimed. His launcher tumbled from his hands, and his body slumped behind the rocks that had failed to protect him. The sound of her shot echoed across the valley, distinct from the chaos of automatic weapons fire. Heads turned. I sought the source, and somewhere in the American position, she heard someone ask what the hell that was. Vasquez worked the bolt, chambered a fresh round, and found her next target. A machine gunner on the western ridge, his PKM spitting fire into the kill zone where wounded operators lay exposed. She calculated, adjusted, squeezed. The machine gun fell silent. She moved to her third target before the second body hit the ground. A fighter with an AK-47 who was maneuvering to flank the American position. He died, never knowing that death had come from the corpsman he would have dismissed as irrelevant. 3 shots, 3 kills. The rhythm of her former life reasserting itself through hands that had tried to forget. Master Chief Okonkwo's voice came over the radio, controlled but carrying an undercurrent of disbelief. He asked who was shooting. He said those were precision shots, marksman shots, and their marksman was down. He demanded to know who had taken up the rifle. Vasquez keyed her radio. Her voice was steady, calmer than she felt, carrying the command presence of someone who had led Marines through firefights that made this ambush look like a training exercise. She said it was the nurse. She said she had the Eastern Ridge. She told them to keep their heads down and let her work. Then she pressed her eye to the scope and went hunting. The nurse. The words hung in the air like smoke from a rifle, and for a long moment the radio channel fell silent as operators processed what they had just heard. Vasquez did not wait for their confusion to resolve. She was already tracking her fourth target, a spotter on the Eastern Ridge who was directing fire for the remaining machine gun positions. He was young, barely more than a boy, his face visible through her scope as he pointed toward the American positions and shouted instructions to his comrades. She felt nothing as she placed the reticle on his chest. Ward did not care about youth or potential or the life he might have lived in a world where geography and ideology had not conspired to put him in her crosshairs. She squeezed the trigger. The boy fell. She worked the bolt and moved on. Behind her, she heard Tanaka calling her name. The young medic trainee had crawled to a position 10 meters away, his face pale with shock and splattered with dust and someone else's blood. He stared at her like he was seeing a stranger wearing the face of someone he thought he knew. She told him to stay down and keep pressure on whoever was bleeding near him. She told him she would handle the ridgelines. Her voice carried an authority she had not used in years, the tone of an instructor who expected immediate compliance and would accept nothing less. Tanaka nodded and disappeared behind cover. She returned her attention to the scope. The enemy was beginning to adjust. Her first shots had been gifts, targets presenting themselves without awareness that a predator had entered the equation. Now, they understood that someone was shooting back with precision, and they were becoming more careful. Heads ducked lower. Movements became faster. The gaps between cover shortened as fighters who had been confident in their elevated positions suddenly felt the vulnerability of being hunted. Good. Let them feel it. Let them understand what it meant to face someone who had spent years perfecting the art of reaching out across impossible distances and ending lives with single, carefully placed rounds. She found a fighter attempting to reposition a PKM, dragging the heavy weapon across rocks to establish a new firing position. He was 600 meters out, partially concealed behind a boulder, only his shoulders and head visible as he worked. The shot was difficult, but not impossible. She adjusted for the increased range, accounted for the wind that had picked up slightly, and sent the round on its way. The fighter slumped over his machine gun and did not move again. Hollister's voice came over the radio, ragged with pain and something that might have been disbelief. He demanded to know what was happening, who was shooting, why his designated marksman was answering calls when Reyes was dead. His words tumbled over each other, the coherence of command dissolving under the pressure of a wound that was draining his blood and his authority simultaneously. Master Chief Okonkwo answered before Vasquez could respond. He told the lieutenant to conserve his strength, that the situation was being handled, that they had unexpected assets in play. His voice was calm, but she could hear the questions beneath it, questions he would ask later when they were not fighting for their lives. She killed 2 more fighters in rapid succession, both of them making the mistake of assuming that the lull in accurate fire meant safety had returned. The first took a round through the throat as he raised his head to observe the American positions. The second died while trying to retrieve the RPG launcher that had fallen when she killed the original gunner. 7 shots, 7 kills. The rifle magazine held 10 rounds, and she had started with 9. 2 remaining before she would need to reload. The enemy fire was slackening, the confidence of the ambush eroding under the weight of casualties they had not anticipated. They had expected to pin a patrol in a kill zone and methodically destroy it. They had not expected to lose nearly half their force to a single shooter whose existence they could not have predicted. But they were not breaking. Not yet. Someone over there was maintaining discipline, keeping fighters in position, reorganizing the assault. She needed to find that someone and remove him from the equation. She scanned the ridgeline with patient eyes, looking for the signs that would identify a leader. Body language that expected obedience. Positioning that suggested command perspective rather than simple fighting position. The indefinable quality that separated those who followed from those who directed. There, Eastern Ridge, 700 meters, a man older than the others with a beard that spoke of experience and authority. He moved between positions, issuing orders, pointing and gesturing with the confidence of someone who had led ambushes before and expected to lead them again. 700 meters was at the edge of reliable accuracy for the 13 Malawian Kwaches in these conditions. The wind had become unpredictable, gusting and swirling through the valley in ways that could push a round off target by inches that translated to misses at this distance. The elevation differential added complexity, the downward angle requiring adjustments that were more art than science. She could make the shot. She had made harder shots in worse conditions, with more lives hanging in the balance. But she would need to be perfect, and perfect required patience she was not sure she had. The commander raised a radio to his mouth, calling for something. Reinforcements, perhaps, or a change in tactics. Whatever he was planning, she could not allow it to come to fruition. Vasquez steadied her breathing. She felt her heartbeat slow, the world narrowing to the circle of her scope, and the calculations running through her mind. Wind speed, direction, angle, distance, the curve of the Earth itself at this range. All of it processed and translated into the minute adjustments of her aim. She exhaled half a breath and held. The trigger broke clean, and 700 meters away, the commander's radio call ended mid-sentence as the round found him exactly where she had intended. The commander's death rippled through the enemy positions like a stone dropped into still water. Vasquez watched through her scope as fighters who had been holding discipline suddenly found themselves without direction. Some continued firing, but their shots were wild now, unaimed, the desperate reflex of men who sensed the battle turning against them. Others began to withdraw, scrambling back from the ridgeline toward the safety of the reverse slope. She had 1 round remaining in the magazine. She needed to make it count. A fighter on the western ridge was rallying others, gesturing for them to hold position, trying to fill the leadership vacuum she had just created. He was younger than the commander she had killed, but he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had authority among his peers. If she let him establish control, the enemy might regroup. The ambush might resume. Her teammates might still die in this valley. 550 meters. Crosswind gusting unpredictably. Her single remaining round would need to fly true through air that seemed determined to push it astray. She made the adjustments, trusted her calculations, and fired. The would-be leader spun and fell, and the fighters around it broke. Not an organized retreat, but a rout. Men abandoning positions and weapons in their haste to escape the invisible death that had claimed 9 of their brothers in the span of minutes. Vasquez lowered the rifle and released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her hands were trembling now, the adrenaline that had sustained her beginning to ebb as the immediate threat diminished. The scope had left a ring around her eye from pressing too hard, and her shoulder ached from the repeated recoil she had absorbed without proper positioning. She ejected the empty magazine and reached for Reyes's ammunition pouch. Her fingers found 2 full magazines, 20 rounds total. If the enemy returned or if reinforcements arrived, she would need every one of them. The radio crackled with voices, operators calling status reports and casualty counts. 2 dead, including Reyes. For wounded, one of them critical. Hollister was still alive, but fading, his tourniquet holding, but his blood pressure dropping. Air support was 8 minutes out. 8 minutes. An eternity in combat, but survivable now that the enemy fire had ceased. Master Chief Okonkwo's voice came over the net, directed specifically at her. He asked her to confirm her status and position. He asked if she was wounded. He asked, with a careful neutrality that could not quite hide his disbelief, how many enemy fighters she had engaged. Vasquez keyed her radio. She reported 9 confirmed kills. She reported that she was uninjured and maintaining overwatch on the eastern ridge. She reported that enemy forces appeared to be withdrawing, but that she was prepared to re-engage if they returned. The silence that followed her transmission stretched for several seconds. She could imagine the looks being exchanged among the surviving operators, the questions forming in minds that were struggling to reconcile what they had witnessed with what they thought they knew about their corpsmen. Senior Chief Webb broke the silence. His voice carried wonder and something approaching awe. He said he had been in firefights across 3 continents, and he had never seen shooting like that. He said whoever had trained her deserved a medal. He said that when they got back to base, he wanted to know everything. Vasquez did not respond. She was watching the ridgeline, looking for any sign of renewed aggression, any indication that the enemy was regrouping for another attempt. The scope moved in slow arcs across the terrain, her eye cataloging details and dismissing them in rapid succession. Movement. Eastern Ridge. Not a fighter, but something else, something that resolved through the magnification into a shape that made her blood turn cold. Reinforcements. A technical vehicle climbing the mountain road on the far side of the ridge, its bed mounted with a heavy machine gun that would turn their position into a slaughterhouse. Behind it, she could see dust clouds that suggested more vehicles following. She keyed the radio and reported the contact. Her voice was flat, professional, betraying none of the fear that coiled in her stomach. 1 vehicle confirmed with mounted weapon, additional vehicles probable. Range approximately 1,000 meters and closing. 1,000 meters was beyond effective range for the 13 Malawian Kwachas in her hands. The rifle was capable, but the variables at that distance multiplied into uncertainty that made precision impossible. She would need to wait until they closed, until they entered the envelope where her skills could overcome the limitations of physics. Okonkwo responded immediately. He ordered the team to prepare for vehicle assault, to consolidate wounded in the most protected position, to ready anti-armor weapons. His voice carried the grim resolve of a man who understood that survival had just become significantly more complicated. Vasquez watched the technical descend toward the valley floor. The gunner in the bed was already traversing the heavy weapon, searching for targets. In minutes, he would have line of sight to the American positions, and his gun would tear through the rocks that had barely protected them from rifle fire. She calculated angles and distances, running scenarios through a mind that had spent years solving exactly these kinds of problems. The technical would need to slow for the terrain. There would be a moment, a window, when the vehicle was vulnerable and the gunner was exposed. If she could time her shot perfectly, if she could account for all the variables that conspired against accuracy at extreme range, she might be able to eliminate the threat before it eliminated them. One chance, one shot. The mathematics of survival reduced to the simple question of whether her skills were equal to the task. She pressed her eye to the scope and waited for her moment. The technical bounced down the mountain road, dust billowing behind it like a herald announcing the arrival of death. Vasquez tracked its progress through her scope, watching the gunner brace himself against the cab as the vehicle negotiated terrain that threatened to throw him from his perch. The heavy machine gun mounted in the bed was a DSHK, Soviet-designed, capable of punching through light armor and turning human bodies into unrecognizable wreckage. 800 meters. Still too far for a reliable shot against a moving target on an unstable platform. She needed patience, needed to wait for the mathematics to shift in her favor, needed to trust that the moment would come before the gunner found his targets. Behind her, she heard the sounds of her teammates preparing for the worst. Operators checked weapons and distributed ammunition. The critical casualty was being stabilized as best as the remaining medics could manage. Someone was praying in a whisper that carried through the sudden quiet of the valley. Tanaka appeared at her elbow, crawling through the dust to reach her position. His face was streaked with dirt and dry blood, but his eyes were steady. He told her that Petty Officer Kowalski was hit bad, that he had done everything she taught him, but the bleeding would not stop. He asked what he should do. Vasquez faced an impossible choice. The vehicle was closing. The gunner would have line of sight in moments, and she was the only thing standing between that weapon and the slaughter of everyone she had sworn to protect. But Kowalski was dying, and she was the most qualified medical provider in the valley, and every second she spent behind this rifle was a second she was not spending trying to save his life. She looked at Tanaka, seeing the fear he was trying to hide, the desperation of a young man who had been thrust into a situation that exceeded his training and experience. She thought of Hendricks, the Marine who had died in Ramadi because she could not help him. She thought of Reyes, whose final act had been to put this rifle in her hands. The warrior and the healer. Two halves of herself that she had tried to separate, to choose between, as if a person could carve away pieces of their soul and still remain whole. She made her decision. She told Tanaka to take the rifle. She told him to hold it exactly as she showed him, to press his eye to the scope, to keep the reticle on the vehicle as it approached. She told him that when she said fire, he needed to squeeze the trigger smoothly and let the weapon do its work. Tanaka's eyes went wide. He protested that he was not a marksman, that he had barely qualified on his service pistol, that he could not make a shot like the one she had been making. His voice cracked with the certainty of failure. Vasquez gripped his shoulder and looked directly into his eyes. She told him that she would be back before the vehicle reached effective range. She told him that he would not need to be a marksman, only a placeholder, someone to maintain the illusion that a shooter was still covering the approach. She told him to trust her. Then she pressed the rifle into his trembling hands and sprinted toward the position where Kowalski lay dying. The distance was 30 meters, an eternity of exposed ground that she covered in seconds that felt like hours. Rounds were not flying, the enemy withdrawn, and the vehicle still too distant, but she felt naked without the rifle, vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with physical protection. She slid into position beside Kowalski and saw immediately that Tanaka had been right. The wound was catastrophic, a hand-throw abdominal injury that had lacerated the liver and possibly the inferior vena cava. Blood pooled beneath him despite the pressure dressings that had been applied, and his skin had taken on the waxy pallor of hemorrhagic shock. Her hands moved with the speed and precision of someone who had performed these procedures hundreds of times. She tore open fresh trauma dressings, packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, applied pressure with strength that would leave bruises on a patient who survived long enough to develop them. She spoke to Kowalski in the calm, steady voice she used with all her patients, telling him to hang on, telling him that extraction was coming, telling him that she would not let him die in this valley. The radio crackled. Tanaka's voice, high and frightened. The vehicle was at 600 meters and closing. The gunner was traversing, searching. He asked what he should do. Vasquez told him to wait. She told him to keep the scope on the gunner's chest. She told him that she would be there before the shot was needed. Her hands continued working, tying off bleeders, stabilizing what could be stabilized, buying minutes that might be all Kowalski had left. She was aware of time passing with agonizing slowness, aware of the vehicle grinding closer, aware that the margin between survival and annihilation was measured in seconds she was spending on a patient who might die anyway. 500 meters, Tanaka reported. Then 450. Then 400. Vasquez tied off the last accessible bleeder and looked at Kowalski. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but present. He was alive. Whether he would remain alive depended on factors beyond her control. She told the operator beside Kowalski to maintain pressure and monitor his breathing. Then she ran. The sprint back to Tanaka felt longer than the sprint away. Her lungs burned with thin mountain air. Her legs ached from the exertion. Her mind calculated distances and times with the cold precision of someone who understood exactly how narrow the margins had become. She reached Tanaka just as the technical crested the final rise and the gunner found his target. 350 meters. The DSHK began to swing toward the American positions, and Vasquez saw the moment crystallize into the binary simplicity of combat. Kill or die. No other options remained. She took the rifle from Tanaka's hands, settled into position, found the gunner in her scope, and fired before her next heartbeat. The gunner's head snapped back, and he collapsed over the weapon he would never fire. The technical swerved as the driver reacted to the sudden violence, the vehicle careening across the uneven terrain before grinding to a halt against a boulder that crumpled its front end. Vasquez worked the bolt and found the driver through her scope. He was scrambling from the cab, reaching for a rifle, his movements frantic with the desperation of a man who understood that death was hunting him. She gave him 2 seconds to recognize his situation, to understand that survival meant surrender. He raised a rifle toward the American positions. She fired. He fell. The second vehicle in the convoy was already reversing, the driver having witnessed the destruction of the lead technical and chosen wisdom over valor. Vasquez tracked it through her scope as it retreated up the mountain road, waiting to see if it would stop, if reinforcements would dismount and attempt to continue the assault on foot. The vehicle disappeared over the ridge and did not return. She lowered the rifle and allowed herself to breathe. The valley had fallen silent except for the distant sound of helicopter rotors growing louder with each passing second. Air support. Extraction. The cavalry arriving after the battle had already been decided by a woman they would never have expected to fight it. 11 kills. The number settled into her consciousness with a weight that would take years to process. 11 men who had woken this morning with plans and hopes, and people who loved them, now cooling in the mountain dust because they had chosen violence and encountered someone better at it than they were. She had sworn she would never kill again. She had traded her rifle for medical supplies and promised herself that her hands would only heal, never harm. But promises made in peacetime shattered against the reality of watching teammates die, and she found that she could not regret what she had done. Not yet. The regret would come later, in quiet moments when the adrenaline had faded and the faces of the dead visited her in dreams she could not escape. For now, there was only the hollow relief of survival and the knowledge that the men who trusted her were still alive because she had become what she had tried to stop being. The helicopters crested the ridge, their rotors thundering across the valley as they descended toward the extraction point. 2 Black Hawks with door gunners scanning for threats, followed by a medevac bird that would carry the wounded to surgical facilities where better-equipped doctors would continue the work she had started. Okonkwo appeared beside her, his face a mask of dust and dried blood from a cut above his eyebrow. He looked at the rifle in her hands, then at the ridgelines where bodies marked the position she had silenced. He did not speak for a long moment, and when he finally found words, his voice carried a weight that transcended the immediate moment. He said that in 1997, he competed in the Military Marksmanship Championships at Camp Perry. He said he finished 4th in his category, the highest any SEAL had placed in years. He said he had watched every shooter who beat him, studied their form, memorized their names. Vasquez met his eyes, but said nothing. He said that the woman who won the President's 100 that year was a Marine. He said she shot with a precision that bordered on supernatural, placing rounds through the same hole at distances that made other competitors shake their heads in disbelief. He said he had never forgotten her name. The silence stretched between them, filled with the roar of approaching helicopters and the distant shouts of men preparing for extraction. He said her name was Renata Vasquez. He said her call sign was Whisper. He said that he had heard stories about her for years afterward, whispered legends about a female instructor at the Scout Sniper School who could outshoot any student, any instructor, anyone who dared to challenge her. He said those stories had seemed too extraordinary to be true. Vasquez felt something shift inside her chest, a wall that had stood for years beginning to crumble under the weight of recognition she had spent so long avoiding. She looked at Okonkwo and saw not judgment, but understanding, not accusation, but respect earned through demonstrated excellence. She told him that was a long time ago. She told him she was a corpsman now, that she had left that life behind, that she had not intended to pick up a rifle ever again. Okonkwo looked at the bodies on the ridgeline, at the destroyed technical, at the teammates who were alive because of what she had done. He told her that sometimes the life we leave behind refuses to let us go. He told her that there was no shame in being exceptional at multiple things. He told her that today, her past and her present had come together to save lives that would otherwise have been lost. The medevac helicopter touched down, and medical personnel poured out to begin triaging the wounded. Vasquez watched them work, saw Kowalski being loaded onto a stretcher, saw the efficiency of professionals doing what they had been trained to do. She was one of them. She was also something else. For the first time in years, she considered the possibility that she did not have to choose between the two. Okonkwo put a hand on her shoulder. He told her that when they returned to base, there would be questions. He told her that her secret was no longer secret, that too many people had witnessed what she could do. He asked if she was ready for what came next. Vasquez looked at the rifle in her hands, at the scope that had shown her 11 men in the moments before she ended them, at the weapon that had felt like betrayal when she first picked it up and now felt like something closer to reconciliation. She told him she did not know, but she was ready to find out. The forward operating base erupted into controlled chaos when the helicopters touched down. Medical teams rushed to receive the wounded, their movements precise and urgent as stretchers were unloaded and patients were triaged according to the severity of their injuries. Vasquez worked alongside them, her hands moving from rifle to medical supplies with a fluidity that felt natural for the first time in years. She helped stabilize Kowalski for transport to the surgical facility at Bagram. She checked bandages and monitored vital signs and did the work she had trained herself to do after she stopped doing the other thing. But she felt eyes on her wherever she moved, operators who had witnessed what happened in the valley, watching her with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something that looked like reverence. Hollister was wheeled past on a stretcher, his face pale from blood loss, his eyes glassy with the morphine that was keeping him from screaming. He saw her standing there, rifle slung across her back, and something shifted in his expression. He tried to speak, but the words would not come. She watched him disappear into the medical facility without acknowledging his attempt at communication. There would be time for that conversation later, or there would not. Either way, she could not find it in herself to care what Brock Hollister thought about her anymore. The debrief began 2 hours later, after the wounded had been evacuated and the dead had been prepared for transport home. Vasquez sat in the Tactical Operations Center, surrounded by the surviving members of the patrol, facing a panel of officers who had assembled to understand what had happened in the valley. The questions came in waves. Who had assumed the marksman role after Reyes fell? How many enemy combatants had been engaged? What weapons had been used? The officers asked with the careful neutrality of people who had heard initial reports and were struggling to believe them. Vasquez answered each question with the precision she had applied to her shooting. She described the ambush, the casualties, the decision to take up Reyes's rifle when the team was pinned and unable to effectively return fire. She listed her kills with the clinical detachment of an after-action report, providing ranges and conditions and the tactical reasoning behind each engagement. The room grew quieter with each answer. Officers exchanged glances that carried conversations she could not hear. Someone in the back of the room was typing furiously, pulling records, searching for information that would either confirm or contradict what they were hearing. The commander of the debrief panel, a captain whose name she had not caught, leaned forward in his chair. He said that her service record indicated she was a hospital corpsman, that she had been assigned to this team in a medical support role. He asked how a corpsman had acquired the marksmanship skills necessary to achieve 11 confirmed kills in a single engagement. Vasquez felt the weight of every eye in the room. She thought of the years she had spent hiding, the careful construction of an identity that allowed her to heal without being reminded of the killing she had done. She thought of Reyes pressing the rifle into her hands, of his final words, of the trust he had placed in someone whose capabilities he had somehow recognized. She took a breath and told the truth. She told them her full name was Chief Hospital Corpsman Renata Vasquez. She told them that before she was a corpsman, she had served in the United States Marine Corps. She told them her military occupational specialty had been 0317 Scout Sniper. The typing in the back of the room stopped. The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit struggling against the Afghan heat. She continued. She told them she had served 3 combat deployments as a sniper, that she had 43 confirmed kills before today, that she had been an instructor at the Scout Sniper School from 2003 to 2008. She told them her call sign had been Whisper. The captain's face had lost color. He asked her to repeat the call sign. Whisper, she said again, because the targets never heard the shot that killed them. Someone in the back of the room found what they were looking for. A voice she did not recognize read from her service record with the stunned cadence of someone discovering buried treasure. Prior service United States Marine Corps. MOS 0317 Scout Sniper. Instructor, Scout Sniper School, Quantico. 43 confirmed kills across deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Bronze Star with V device for valor in combat. Purple Heart. Distinguished Marksman Qualification. President's 100, 1997. The room erupted into murmurs that bordered on chaos. Officers who had been skeptical moments before stared at her with expressions that mixed shock and something approaching awe. The team members who had survived the valley looked at each other as the full scope of what they had witnessed became clear. Master Chief Okonkwo spoke from his position against the wall. His voice cut through the noise like a knife through silk. He said that he had competed against her at Camp Perry in 1997. He said she had beaten every shooter there by a margin that was still discussed in marksmanship circles. He said that the stories about her at Scout Sniper School were legendary, that instructors still spoke of a woman who could outshoot anyone who challenged her. He said that today, those stories had proven to be understatements. Vasquez sat in the center of the attention, feeling exposed in ways that combat had never made her feel. She had spent years hiding this part of herself, convinced that she could only be one thing or the other, healer or killer, corpsman or sniper. The revelation had stripped away that illusion, leaving her naked before colleagues who were only now beginning to understand who she really was. The captain closed the folder in front of him. He said that her actions in the valley had saved the lives of every surviving member of the patrol. He said that the after-action report would reflect her extraordinary performance under fire. He said that there would be recommendations for commendation. He also said that there would be many more questions in the days to come, from people far above his pay grade who would want to understand how a legendary sniper had been hiding in their medical corps for years. Vasquez nodded. She had known this moment would come eventually, had dreaded it for years. But sitting here now, having done what she had done, she found that the dread had transformed into something else, something that felt almost like relief. 3 days passed before Hollister asked to see her. Vasquez had spent those days in a strange limbo, still performing her duties as the team's corpsman, while the reality of what she had revealed settled over the base like a change in atmospheric pressure. People treated her differently now. The casual dismissals had vanished, replaced by a deference that made her uncomfortable in ways she could not fully articulate. She had not wanted reverence. She had only wanted to be allowed to do her job. She found Hollister in the recovery ward, his leg elevated and wrapped in bandages that would need to be changed twice daily for the next several weeks. The wound had been severe, but survivable, the bullet passing through muscle without hitting the femoral artery that would have killed him in the valley. He would walk again, eventually. He would return to duty, if he chose to. He looked smaller in the hospital bed than he had in the Tactical Operations Center. The confidence that had defined him, that had allowed him to dismiss her contributions and mock her presence, had drained away with the blood he had lost on the valley floor. What remained was a man confronting the wreckage of assumptions that had nearly gotten his entire team killed. She stood at the foot of his bed and waited for him to speak. She would not make this easy for him. She had spent months enduring his contempt, and she found that she had no interest in smoothing the path toward whatever absolution he was seeking. Hollister looked at her for a long moment before finding his voice. He said he did not know where to begin. He said that everything he thought he knew about her had been wrong, that his own arrogance had blinded him to capabilities that might have prevented the ambush if he had listened to her warnings. He said that Reyes was dead because he had dismissed tactical advice from someone whose judgment was better than his own. Vasquez let his words hang in the air. She did not offer comfort or contradiction. She simply waited. He continued. He said he'd spent his career believing that he could assess people accurately, that his instincts about who belonged and who did not were reliable. He said he had looked at her and seen a political token, a box check to satisfy demand from people who did not understand combat. He said he had been so certain of his own perception that he had never considered the possibility that he was catastrophically wrong. She asked him what he wanted from her. Her voice carried no anger, no satisfaction, no emotion at all. She had moved past the point where his opinion mattered. He said he wanted to apologize, but he knew that words were insufficient. He said he wanted to understand how she had become what she was, how someone could be both the healer who had saved Kowalski and the shooter who had killed 11 men. He said he wanted to learn if she was willing to teach him. Vasquez considered his request. She thought of the men who had doubted her at Scout Sniper School, the instructors who had resented her presence, the students who had refused to believe a woman could teach them anything about their craft. Most of them had never changed, had carried their contempt to graves or retirements without ever acknowledging what she had proven. But a few had grown, had allowed their assumptions to be shattered by undeniable evidence, had become better operators and better men because they had encountered someone who forced them to question what they believed. She did not know which category Hollister would fall into, but she knew that refusing to engage would guarantee he remained in the first. She told him that she had not picked up the rifle to prove anything to him. She told him that Reyes had died in her arms, and that his final words had been a recognition of what she was and a demand that she use it to save his brothers. She told him that she had spent years trying to be only one thing, and that the valley had shown her the impossibility of that separation. She told him that she had watched a young Marine die in Ramadi because she knew how to kill but not how to heal. She told him that his death had driven her to medical training, to a complete reinvention of her purpose, to the belief that she could atone for the lives she had taken by dedicating herself to saving lives instead. She told him that yesterday she had learned she was wrong about that too. Not wrong to become a healer, but wrong to think that healing required abandoning her other skills. The rifle and the medical kit were both tools. The hands that wielded them made the choice about whether they served life or death. Hollister listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that he had underestimated her in every possible way, and that his underestimation had nearly cost the lives of everyone under his command. He said that if he survived this deployment and returned to a leadership position, he would carry the lesson of this valley with him for the rest of his career. He asked if she would train him to shoot better, not because he thought he could ever match her skill, but because the request was the only concrete offering he could make. A willingness to learn from someone he had dismissed, an acknowledgement that expertise did not care about the packages that came in. Vasquez looked at him for a long moment. She saw the man who had mocked her, but she also saw someone whose arrogance had cracked under the weight of consequences. She did not know if he would change, if the lessons of the valley would persist beyond the pain of his recovery. but she knew that refusing to engage would close a door that might never open again. She told him that when he could walk again, she would take him to the range. She told him that she would teach him what she had learned in years of sending rounds downrange at distances that most people could not comprehend. She told him that the first lesson would be the hardest one. He asked what the first lesson was. She told him it was learning to listen to people whose expertise he had been trained to dismiss. Then she turned and walked out of the recovery ward, leaving him to consider whether he was capable of becoming the kind of leader who could receive that lesson. The ceremony took place on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the ambush in the Coringal Valley. Vasquez stood at attention in her dress uniform, the fabric crisp and unfamiliar after months of combat utilities and medical scrubs. The forward operating base had been transformed for the occasion, flags snapping in the mountain wind, chairs arranged in precise rows, a podium positioned before an audience that included every available member of the command. Rear Admiral Catherine Prescott had arrived the previous evening, her presence announced with the fanfare that accompanied flag officers in theater. She was a small woman with silver hair and eyes that carried the weight of 30 years in a service that had not always welcomed her. She had requested this assignment personally, traveling from Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters to preside over what she called a matter of particular significance. The Admiral approached the podium and looked out at the assembled personnel. She spoke of valor and sacrifice, of the bonds forged in combat, of the debts owed to those who placed themselves between violence and the innocent. Her words were formal, but carried an undercurrent of something personal, something that suggested she understood dimensions of this story that official reports could not capture. She spoke of the ambush. She described the tactical situation, the casualties sustained, the desperate moments when the patrol had faced annihilation. She recounted the actions of Chief Hospital Corpsman Renata Vasquez with the precision of someone who had studied the after-action reports until she could recite them from memory. 11 confirmed kills. A destroyed technical vehicle. The elimination of enemy leadership that had broken the assault and saved the surviving members of the patrol. Actions taken by a medical professional who had revealed capabilities that exceeded anything her current role suggested. The Admiral paused and looked directly at Vasquez. She said that what made this case remarkable was not simply the marksmanship displayed, though that marksmanship would be studied at training facilities for years to come. What made it remarkable was the woman behind a rifle. She recounted Vasquez's history. The Marine Corps service, the Scout Sniper qualification, the years as an instructor at one of the most demanding schools in the military. The decision to leave that world behind and become a healer, to trade the scope for surgical tools, to dedicate herself to saving lives after years of ending them. She said that Chief Vasquez had tried to be one thing and had discovered in the crucible of combat that she was irreducibly two things, and that both were necessary. The Admiral stepped back from the podium and called Vasquez forward. The walk across the open ground felt longer than any movement under fire, the eyes of her colleagues pressing against her with a weight that was harder to bear than bullets. She stopped before the Admiral and rendered a salute that was returned with equal precision. The Admiral opened a case and removed the silver star, its ribbon bright against the velvet lining. She read the citation aloud, the formal language describing actions that had felt like instinct in the moment and only became heroism in the retelling. The medal was pinned to her chest, cold metal against fabric that suddenly felt too thin. The Admiral shook her hand and held it for a moment longer than protocol required. She spoke quietly, words meant only for Vasquez. She said that she had been following her career since Camp Perry in 1997. She said that she had watched from a distance as Vasquez blazed trails through communities that had never welcomed women, as she had proven again and again that excellence recognized no gender. She said that today's recognition was overdue by decades. Vasquez thanked her, the words feeling inadequate against the weight of the moment. The Admiral stepped back and addressed the assembly once more. She announced that effective immediately, Chief Hospital Corpsman Renata Vasquez was being assigned to a newly created position. She would serve as the primary instructor for an integrated combat medicine and tactical marksmanship program, training the next generation of special operations personnel in the skills that had saved lives in the Karengal Valley. She said that Vasquez would no longer have to choose between being a healer and being a warrior. Her new role would require her to be both, and to teach others that the distinction was often an illusion created by those who could not imagine being more than one thing. The ceremony concluded with honors rendered, the sharp crack of rifles in salute echoing off the mountain walls. Vasquez stood at attention through it all, feeling the weight of the medal on her chest and the heavier weight of the responsibility it represented. Afterward, she found herself at the memorial wall where Reyes's name had been added alongside the others lost in the valley. She stood before the plaque and spoke to him quietly, the way she had spoken to Hendricks and Ramadi all those years ago. She told him that he had been right about her. She told him that his final gift had been the permission to become whole again, to stop pretending that she could carve away pieces of herself and still function. She told him that she would spend the rest of her career teaching others what he had recognized in her from the beginning. The rifle and the medical kit, the killer and the healer, two halves of the same person, finally allowed to coexist. She touched his name on the wall, then turned and walked toward the training facility where her first class of students waited. They would learn to shoot, and they would learn to heal, and they would carry forward the lesson that Reyes had taught her with his dying breath. Some people were not meant to be only one thing. Some people were meant to be everything their circumstances required. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage comes in forms we do not always expect, please subscribe to our channel and share with us in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone reveal a strength that no one knew they possessed? Have you ever been underestimated by people who could not see past their own assumptions? These stories matter because they remind us that the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones dismissed as irrelevant, might be the very ones who save us when everything falls apart. Thank you for watching. And remember, every person you meet carries depths you cannot imagine. Some of them might just be legendary.